As more and more school systems return to normal, there are new glaring realities of the far reaching impact COVID is having on our youth. Hello, and welcome to another edition of COVID Conversations. I'm Harold Fisher. Now, today, my guest says the COVID pandemic has made a bad situation worse when it comes to learning for people of color, especially young Black males. Desmond Williams is a former principal and author of the book Burning House: Educating Black Boys in America. Mr. Williams, thank you so much for joining the COVID conversation.
Brother Harold, thank you for having me, sir. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So let's start off with what we've often heard, this common repeated phrase: when white America catches a cold, Black folks get pneumonia. That
Mhm.
certainly seems to ring true when we're talking about the pandemic. As an educator, talk to us about the impact COVID has had on our Black youth and their
Mhm.
ability to learn in the changing environment.
Yeah, I think the first thing we have to look at is where are we moving with literacy? I think that's the beginning point of the conversation. And in my observation and working with many schools, we are really trying to figure out how we can make up time for students in the early elementary grades who lost some of that critical literacy during 2020 and 2021. The other thing that I hear lots of principals say in thinking about the jobs that they do every day, Brother Harold, is they feel as though they spend more time being public health administrators as opposed to being instructional leaders. So when we talk about mask mandates and when we talk about um, the changing things that happen in our buildings because student A was in close contact with this student and this email needs to be sent out, it takes away from the time that principals are able to spend supporting teachers. It's more work for teachers and it just adds to the stress level. So that notion of America having a cold and Black America having pneumonia um, is a really appropriate analogy when we think about how we are um, in communities of color, how we are struggling to create accountability for our students, but at the same time have love for them. Because when you look around, you know, as my father used to tell me, the planet is still spinning. And
Mhm.
in other communities, third grade students are reading at a third and fourth grade level. So the question becomes from a literacy standpoint, like how are we ensuring that our children are still managing um, the expectations that they're going to be expected to meet once they finish 12th grade.
So let's back up just a minute because with everyone shut in during the pandemic, what do you believe was keeping Black children from reading more when going outside and going to other places was not an option?
I think part of um, it was new and we were figuring out what virtual learning would look like. A lot of what we do, um, being a former third grade teacher, a lot of what we as classroom teachers do with technology, with computers, are supplements to support our students in all subjects, but particularly with reading. There's some great, literacy and reading softwares out there. When we started shuttering in place, when the nation started shuttering in place, we had to figure out how do we take these core activities, these core lessons that we have been doing as long as we've been teaching, like how does that translate to a virtual world? And some of those activities, some of those lessons um, did not transfer as easily. The other thing was when we think about, this time in 2020, going to the end of the school year in 2020, is particularly in grades K through 2, how is a 6-year old able to manage being in front of a computer screen for 2.5 hours when the school has said we think it's appropriate for the child to be in front of a computer screen for 4 hours. So maybe 2 hours for reading, 2 hours for math. And I'm making those numbers up, but I think your audience will hear what I'm saying. But there's lost time, right? Because this child is not in school all day. And then there are teachers who are hardworking, who are trying to figure out, how do we make this work in this virtual space? So those are a few of the pressures. And that's just from the teacher and educator side of things. There are other things that have impacted that space in terms of parents not being home, a 13-year-old sibling managing and trying to support a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old sibling, the sharing of different software technologies and things like that, that made that time very cumbersome and stressful.
Even before the pandemic, was education as we know it working for Black children?
So if we were on an elevator, I would say no,
Why is
right? But the question is much more complex and nuanced, um, because we have to look at what do we mean by education? And like this conversation so far, I'm thinking about literacy, um,
Mhm.
but I really, when you ask that question, I think about what does that mean for children who are in inner city schools? When we
Mhm.
close our eyes and we think of a typical inner city school, like we're in Ward 7 or Ward 8 in Washington, D.C., was it working for those schools? I think in a lot of ways we can say that our typical inner city school has some successes. But what about the seventh grade girl who reads on a fourth grade level,
Mhm.
right? What about um, the 14-year-old freshman in 2020 who was reading at a fifth grade level? So the question is really nuanced. One of my mentors and heroes, a brother by the name of Alfred Tatum, um, challenged me. He said, we don't really know, despite all of the research and all of the PhDs, we don't really know where we are in terms of the education of Black children in this country. And one of the things that I've been asking for is for Black people to think about, whether it's the NAACP or organizations working together, to think about, like, what does an educational agenda look like for Black children? And what data points are we using to say that our children are successful or not successful? There are certain measures that we can look at in terms of math scores and reading scores. We can look at NAEP and things like that. But what do those things mean in the short term? What do they mean in the long run? And what do they mean as it relates to a political agenda for Black people and our education working in concert with a political agenda? So I think I skirted your question, and I didn't mean to do that, but it's a very nuanced question. But I think it's suffice to say that there are some children who've had successes, but there are hordes of children who were not as successful, who had been disenfranchised, and the coronavirus has only exacerbated that.
Well, it sounds to me like you were talking about educational equity. And to that point, what do you believe needs to be done now to get Black children, particularly boys, young Black boys, on
Mhm.
equal footing?
Yeah, one of the things I talk about in the book is educational equity, um, by definition, is Black people being able to self-determine what education looks like in their communities. It's more than um, math scores and reading scores. It's more complex than 72% of our high school graduates went to 4-year colleges. It's community control of schools. It's African Americans being able to say, this is what we believe is the appropriate agenda for our people in this community. To me, that's equity. I live in Montgomery County, and uh, the teachers out here, suffice to say, Brother Harold, I'm sorry, the parents out here, suffice to say, they run the schools, right? When I was a principal in DC, I listened to parents, but I didn't necessarily have to acquiesced to groups of parents who thought we should use this curriculum versus this curriculum versus this curriculum. And to some degree, I didn't have those kinds of conversations with parents. So the idea of community control, I think, is really important in terms of educational equity. And I also believe, going back to the quote unquote disenfranchised groups that I mentioned before, the best way to serve those students, I believe, is under a Black agenda. And I do not know if that will happen en masse without Black, independently run private schools. I think there's a need for that, to really think about how are we moving towards educational equity for all. And again, all of those things fall under this notion of educational self-determination.
So, where do you believe parental responsibility will fit into that equation when it comes to a Black educational agenda? Okay, you just said, for example, in Montgomery County,
Hmm.
parents run the school.
Hmm.
Why why can't parents in predominantly Black Ward 7 or Ward 8 in Washington, D.C., or
Hmm.
more expansively, in any predominantly Black community in the country, do the same?
Hmm.
Do parents have a responsibility to improve the education of Black children?
Yeah, I thank you for that question. They do have a responsibility, in terms of like where does that responsibility fall into a larger equation? I believe that's a big part of it, and I think one of the things that, when you talk to principals, when you talk to teachers across the country, they relish and embrace um, communication and partnership with parents. I don't believe that we can actually get there without parents, right? Particularly the way I just described educational equity. That can't be a bus that's strictly driven by politicians and teachers and administrators. Like, parents have to get on the bus, because once parents get on a bus, we can put more students on the bus, and then that puts more pressure on quote unquote politicians and school board and school board leaders and state departments of education and things like that. But ultimately, parents play a big role. And if I had to put a number to it, right, even though this is very formulaic, but for the sake of conversation,
Mhm.
um, that's a big part of the equation. Like, I would say that's a third of it. Like, when parents push agendas, um, things move, and that's one of the things that I have figured out as a person who spent all of his professional career in Washington, D.C., but happens to live outside of the city. It's um, parents move agendas more so than teachers and principals.
So you mentioned literacy several times.
Mhm.
Whose fault is it that Johnny or Susie can't read? Is it the parents' fault? Is it the school system's fault? If
Mhm.
you mentioned third graders,
Mhm.
and let us assume, for the
Mhm.
sake of the conversation, that the parents in the household
Mhm.
can
Mhm.
read well.
Mhm.
But if the third grader cannot,
Mhm.
is it the parents' fault or is it the school system's fault that the third grader, who, let's say, has perfect comprehension skills, that there
Mhm.
are no other kinds of challenges that would prevent that child from reading otherwise?
Mhm. Yeah, I thank you for that question as well, man. You're really pushing me here. I would say though,
Well, I'm a
um,
father,
yeah. So think of.
and my daughter reads well. She's an adult now,
Mhm.
but
Yeah, I would say, brother Harold, I would think of it like success. Like, if Johnny could read, we would say that, let's say for instance he's in third grade, right?
Mhm.
that his pre-K, his kindergarten, first and second and third grade teacher, and parents all had a hand in that, right? So if Johnny cannot read, then I think we have to look at those individuals and the system. And one of the things that I talk about in the book that I just believe is an absolute um, miscarriage of justice is if we know that Johnny can't read in third grade, we have to make sure that we're doing everything we can do to support him. Like when he's in fifth and sixth grade, we
Mhm.
cannot withhold the type of teaching that will support him in learning how to read. So the failure, just like the success, is a syndrome, and there are multiple things that are at play. But I think one of the biggest things that I have seen in my experience is we have dynamite teachers in K through 3 who can teach the fundamentals of reading, and then those are things that we tend to withhold from students once they get to fourth and fifth grade. And once children are in middle school, we don't teach those actual skills to students anymore. So I think it's important to look at individuals, like, do our teachers have the skill set? But as a system, there are failures that are in place. There are systems that are in place that we don't question that allow um, us to pass students on and allow us not to give certain trainings that would really help teachers in middle school who could help pass on some of those skills to support students.
So let's go back to the book real quick. Burning House: Educating Black Boys in America.
Sure.
Give me the cliff notes if you
Mhm,
can. What is it about,
mhm.
and what do you hope readers would take away from it?
Yeah, the cliff note version of the book is um, I categorize education as being a pedagogical process. Like, how do we teach math skills, right? And like, how do we create movement in our classrooms that allow for more activity, more engagement, and things like that? So there's the pedagogical side of things, but there's also the political side of things that I alluded to earlier, like parent engagement, community control of the schools, African Americans thinking about educational self determination. It's a two-part process. Um, so that's one of the things I want us to take away from it. The other with that is we will always have students who are going to college, students who are succeeding in our schools. The number of African Americans with 4-year degrees, Brother Harold, jumped from about 11% in 2000 to about 26% as of 2019. So we're seeing more African Americans with 4-year degrees. The question becomes, what are we doing about the prison industrial complex, the school to prison pipeline? One third, excuse me, 50% of the people in our prisons are Black and brown males. So how are we educating ourselves to protect ourselves from the school to prison pipeline, the prison industrial complex? The other thing I would want us to take away from the book, though, is that our children always, our people always have strived for literacy in this country. And there's a chapter in the book, in chapter 5, I talk about um, the struggle for literacy as per slave codes and anti-literacy laws, and how some of those laws, excuse me, not some of those laws, how those laws walk into our school every day because of disenfranchisement and poor expectations. So our quest for literacy has to be as strong as it was um, in the 1740s and at emancipation and during Reconstruction.
Desmond Williams, author, educator, thank you so much for talking to us. I appreciate your time.
Brother Harold, I appreciate your time, and keep doing what you're doing, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate that as well. And thank you for joining us for another edition of COVID Conversations. Make sure you tune in every Wednesday at noon as we take you beyond the politics and fear and to all of the facts, including the medical facts about COVID. I'm Harold Fisher. Have a safe and healthy week.